Imagine sitting beside a knitter nearly 1,000 years ago. There's no yarn stores, no circular needles, no stitch markers, no measuring tape, no pattern books. Yet somehow they created beautifully knitted socks, hats, bags, and other everyday items that have survived for centuries. How did they spin their yarn? What size needles did they use? And without modern knitting styles, how did they control their tension and even get the stitches onto the needles? In this video, we're traveling back in time to medieval Egypt to discover how some of the world's earliest knitters worked with incredibly fine yarn using techniques that are still fascinating today. If you enjoy learning where knitting came from and how it evolved into the craft we know today, you're going to enjoy this video. Spinning the yarn. Before anyone could knit a sock or a hat, they first had to make the yarn. For thousands of years, from 6,500 BCE until 500 CE, the primary tool for making yarn was something called a spindle. If you've never seen one before, it's surprisingly simple. Here's a picture of a current spindle. The long wooden shaft held the yarn as it was spun. Unfortunately, because wood eventually decays, archaeologists really find those parts today. What they do find are the spindle whorls. Here's some examples. Those small weighted discs were made from materials like baked clay, bone, limestone, and other stones that survived underground for centuries. As the spindle spun, the weight of the whorl helped twist loose fibers into yarn. Although it worked remarkably well, it was also slow. The spinner could produce roughly 450 yards of yarn before stopping to remove the yarn from the spindle. To make skeins with more yardage, each section had to be tied together with knots before spinning could continue. During this time, they used relatively short pieces of yarn, 3 to 6 feet in length, so it wasn't much of a problem. But everything changed through trade. Beginning around the early 1000s CE, Egypt's trade connection with Western India introduced a remarkable invention known as a charka, or floor spinning wheel, which had been used in India since 500 CE. Here's a picture of a charka. Instead of producing one short section at a time, the spinner could continuously produce thousands of yards of yarn. When one spindle filled, the yarn was transferred to a reel, and spinning continued without tying knots between sections. This new technology produced smooth, consistent cotton and silk yarn much faster than the traditional spindle ever could. And that innovation opened the door for something entirely new, knitting. From one needle to many. Before knitting needles existed, many textile items were made using a single needle with an eye. Here's an image of a nalbinding needle that they used. Creating fabric one stitch at a time was durable, but it was also very slow. Once continuous strands of yarn became available from the charka spinning wheel, people began experimenting with multiple needles. By the 11th and 12th century, Egyptian knitters were using sets of double-pointed needles to knit continuously in the round. They weren't the bamboo and aluminum needles we're familiar with today. They were incredibly fine metal knitting pins, usually handcrafted from iron or steel by local blacksmiths or even sometimes by the knitters themselves. Most measured between 10 and 14 inches long. Their diameter was surprisingly small. Many were only 1.5 or 2 millimeters thick, roughly equivalent to modern US size 00 or size 0 needles. With needles this fine, knitters could produce fabrics containing anywhere from 20 to 32 stitches in a single inch. That's far finer than most hand knitters produce today. One interesting detail is that there were no standard needle sizes. No one could simply say, I have a size 0. Instead, every knitter judged the needle by looking at them. They knitted a small sample, what we would call a swatch today, and examined the fabric. If the stitches looked right for the project, those became the needles for that particular garment. Master knitters often guarded their favorite needles carefully because they continuously produced the fabric that they desired. Forming every stitch. This may be the most fascinating part of the story. Their knitting style looked very different from what most of us use today. Instead of wrapping the working yarn around their fingers or holding the yarn between their fingers, the yarn traveled from the ball around the back of the knitter's neck and down to the needles. This acted almost like a built-in tensioning system. The weight of the yarn and the gentle resistance from around the neck helped maintain an even tension while knitting extremely fine cotton and silk yarn. Rather than making large hand movements, the knitter made a tiny motion with their thumb to wrap the yarn around the needle clockwise. Very little wrist movement was required. That meant that they could knit for long periods without the hand fatigue that many knitters experience today. Their stitches were also mounted differently on the needle. Instead of the orientation most Western knitters are familiar with, wrapping the yarn counterclockwise, the stitches sat on the needle in what is now called an Eastern stitch mount. To create an untwisted knit stitch, the needle entered through what we would consider the back leg of the stitch. Another interesting difference is that they probably never used the purl stitch because nearly everything was knitted in the round. The right side of the fabric always faced the knitter. Without turning the work back and forth, there was no need to purl. One stitch, the knit stitch, was enough to create remarkable garments. Their projects included beautifully patterned socks, fitted caps worn beneath turbans, small drawstring bags for coins and valuables, decorative cushion covers, household mats, washcloths, medical wraps, and other everyday necessities. One of the most ingenious techniques appeared in their socks. The heel was knitted separately. When the heel eventually wore out, as sock heels usually do, the damaged heel could simply be removed and replaced without knitting an entirely new sock. Even after nearly 1,000 years, that's still a remarkably practical design. Looking back, it's amazing how much today's knitting has inherited from those early knitters. The tools have changed, the materials have improved, and we've developed many new techniques. But the basic idea remains exactly the same. One stitch at a time, one row after another, creating fabric from a single strand of yarn. In the next videos in this history series, we'll continue exploring how knitting has evolved. If you like to continue this journey through knitting history, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And I'd love to hear from you. Which facts surprised you most? How they spun the yarn, the incredible tiny needles, or the unique way they controlled their tension? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.